right, great, thanks. Hi, everybody. My name's James Watson. I'm on Bundjalung country here in northern New South Wales. I'm based at the University of Queensland. I'm also Director of Science of the Wildlife Conservation Society based out of New York. So today I'm just going to be covering off a few of my thoughts of what's good and what's bad and what's missing or what's ugly in the GBF. It's obviously, given it's only 15 minutes, I won't be able to cover all the views I have, but I just wanted to dive into a few of these points, just probably as a discussion, a conversation starter. So what do I think is good? Well, I think the big thing for me when I've been involved with these GBF discussions over the last few years and actually reading the documents lately is that we've become outcome orientated. Now, the reason why I think this is good, and it's pretty obvious to say it's good, is the ACUICN targets weren't for many of them, and that was a real problem, and that really affected both implementation by nations and also reporting by nations, and also just seeing outcomes for biodiversity, in that you had this mix and match between actions and outcomes. And what I see with the GBF right now is actually it's far more clearly outlined that you have ecosystems, species and population, genetic diversity, outcomes, and actions underneath it supporting them. With the ACUICN targets 10 years ago, for those who remember them, you had protected area targets sitting right alongside species targets. And that really conflated actions and outcomes and was very confusing. And frankly, a lot of nations really reported on actions, but not outcomes, which was a real disappointment, I thought. Let's see if I can move this along. I think another thing that I really like about the GBF in that it's starting to talk to the CBD's vision. Now, for those who haven't actually read the vision, I think it's one of the most inspiring visions out there. By 2050, the biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used. And now that is actually amazing. Nations, 30 years ago came together and said, this is what we need to do. We've got to, to save the planet. We've got 60 years to really do this. And if you look at the goals, you're actually seeing the response really, going through those orders of what biodiversity is. It's not just a species target, but it's a species, an ecosystem, and genetic set of goals. And again, that's a real departure, I think, in what we've seen in the past. And so for the first time, we're seeing these kind of goals mesh towards the vision, and actually with the milestones and the 2030 goals in between, which is a good thing, and that's a healthy thing. There's a theory of change there, which is articulated at the beginning, which is useful to see, and you can see where it all fits together. And I think this is a really big step forward. What I like about this kind of move is that it really links into how we think about human health responses. We're talking about species extinctions, which is really an emergency room response. We're talking about rehabilitation. We're talking, which is around restoration of these ecosystems and these trying to prevent species from declining. So we're talking about restorative health as well, not just about saving species from the morgue, and preventative health as well, where you're actually trying to keep ecosystems and systems intact and functioning, doing what it's meant to do. So it's a really like a human health response to in the wider society, we're starting to see a biodiversity conservation whole of societal response as well, in terms of what's on the paper, which again is good to see. Another good thing I like about it is there's an ecosystem goal, and that is actually great. In the ACUICN targets, there was target 5, which was talking mostly about forests. It came out of the forest targets, and it was kind of a soft target and not a very sensible one. But now there's an ecosystem goal, and that really is on the back of a huge amount of work done by people in this room. I've got to shout out to people like Emily Nicholson, who's a world leader in ecosystem science and ecosystem management, and she's led the way in terms of talking about this. Simon Ferrier, I believe, is on this call, has spent a lot of time talking about this. Lots of other people have been making this point over and over again, and we're starting to see it happening. We're actually seeing something around ecosystems, and I'm going to let Emily talk about this in detail, but this is a wonderful change that we didn't have 10 years ago, and it's a really good example of a few noisy people really banging the drum and trying to make something happen. And you can make something happen if you bang the drum loud enough. And hats off to those people who really getting stuck in and getting it done. you know, when you think about the ecosystem goal, it was actually started in the Rio Declaration in 1992. We talked about the integrity of the Earth's ecosystem in the most profound of the principles in the Rio Declaration. So it's not actually a new concept, it's actually a founding concept with CBD, the UNFCCC. It's just taken 30 years to get there. But it's good we've got there in the end. So the bad, well, I think, you know, if you read the documents, I don't think there's much impetus around land use change and really loss of species and ecosystems though. And you know, this is the kind of graph you see about this full recovery by 2050 to see the CBD's mission. But I really don't like this kind of the bending of the curve, still going negative, and bending back sometime in the next 5 to 10 years to get to 2030, and then on the way to full recovery. We're effectively accepting the locking in loss, and I don't like that at all. We have to be far more ambitious now. This is just a general overview of the whole thing, and that is, the milestones and targets aren't as ambitious as it should be, and I don't think this kind of figure should be celebrated, that we're locking in loss over the next 10 years to get to full recovery. I think we could have a bending of the curve at 2020. It doesn't have to go into 2025. We're still losing species. And this is associated bad. I think the milestone, you know, around species extinctions is just not, you know, really, really low brow. It's a low. It's just an appalling kind of target if you think about it. You know, we're talking about slowing the rate, reversing the rate of extinctions. It's not even talking about a state. We're talking about a rate, which is if those people know about how you set targets, that's an appalling thing to do. To set a target on a rate, not a state. You know, and to reduce extinction risk by 10%, I mean, that is just really mediocre, I think. It's not ambitious at all. And Australia has an appallingly bad track record when it comes to extinctions, and this kind of thing is going to make things worse. We can be far more ambitious around this stuff, and we should be. Most Australian citizens don't like species extinctions. We should be leading the way and saying this is not acceptable, because it's not acceptable as a milestone. Why can't we be ambitious? We could set something like this, what Brooke Williams and colleagues proposed in 2021. That's not even ambitious, I don't think, that proposal, but at least it can be measured and you can actually start bending the curve back for species. That's, I would say, a far more realistic target. Another bad thing, well, I think this 30% number is problematic, and the reason why is that while it's bigger than 17%, it's just not founded on evidence, on any kind of ecological evidence. You know, if we, excuse me, why isn't it moving? There we go. There is science out there which says, well, how much land and sea does biodiversity need? You know, and there's been 30 or 40 years of good science done on this. The latest science done out of EASA, out of Europe, by a frustrated or in One Earth, and by Kendall Jones in One Earth as well, you know, that's the marine side of things, shows that at least 60% of land and sea needs to be conserved in most ways to prevent extinction, reverse decline, retain intactness. Those 3 health preventions I mentioned earlier. So it's only, you know, this 30% is nowhere near enough, and we've got to be honest about that. You know, and when you look at the science underlying these papers, they're not using the best available data. It's using only known species data, so it's incomplete biodiversity data. It's using a very incomplete key biodiversity area data list. And you know, Golo's on this phone on this call now. Golo will be able to tell us that there's many thousands of key biodiversity areas which haven't been mapped yet. It doesn't even map ecosystems or integrity, and it's completely blind to climate change. So it means that the 60% number or 64% number, or whatever it comes out to be, is a massive underestimate. You know, so 30% is far too small. And from an Australian perspective, this is a piece of science that one of my students has been involved with. If you just overlay threatened species and land tenure across the protected area network, the green numbers are the area of land that species are protected by protected areas. But if you see the size of yellow, which is freehold land, fenced land, and all these other things, you'll see that most species live beyond the protected area fence. And even if you allocated the best areas of land to get to 30%, most species will still live beyond the protected area fence. So again, this 30% number, we've got to be really careful with it. The ugly, or, you know, or whatever we want to talk about it now. Like this is the, you know, last part of my talk. I'm a little bit concerned about how we're communicating that some of this high level ambition. This is one of the media releases that was sent out by our federal minister saying that we are already at 29% of land and sea protected areas, and we have the largest representative marine systems in the planet. This kind of language, I think, is really not self-reflective in the way that we should be when we're setting a big target. I think if you were to look at how we performed over the last 10 years, and this is how Australia did perform, the grey background is the growth in the protected area network. The lines that you can see, the colourful lines, are actually how representation increased of key biodiversity areas, mammals, ecoregions, amphibians, and reptiles, and you'll see a much more subtle increase. What this means is that while the protected areas are increasing, we're not targeting important biodiversity areas. In fact, a random selection of protected areas would do better than what we did in the last 10 years. So when we have ministers celebrating the fact that we've got a very large protected area network, we're not selecting biodiversity important areas. So it's actually an own goal, if you think about it. So the next 10 years, when we're thinking about 30 by 2030, can't repeat the last 10 years. And I don't think that the ministers are really thinking about this in a way, or communicating that in the way that potentially we could be communicating, and say, look, we got it wrong the last 10 years, let's get the next 10 years right. This is another way of talking about it. This is the ACUICN targets of the last 10 years. This is Martine Moron's analysis, which I thought was quite amusing in the ESA last week, but I just wanted to copy off her, is that if we think about how Australia went over the last 10 years, and I think Peter mentioned that we didn't do that well, Martine's analysis is we did very, very badly. If you went through Australia and how we ticked off the last 20, the ACUICN targets over the last 10 years, if every time you look at a target and actually have a look at it, we did very, very badly. So I think, again, we've got to start thinking about how we communicate our ambitions and how we communicate how we're going and account for it properly. So I'll just finish off by saying, look, if, really nailing on this 30%, because I suspect that's what people want to talk about, is one of these things in the next few days. It's just obvious thing to say that 30% is too small, but it must count. And the good news is Australia, unlike many other countries around the world, has the data and has the scientific know-how and probably the social buy-in to ensure that the 30% can count. We can actually work out where we can go and save ecosystems and species and genetic resources in a way that means it's climately the best response to climate change from a species and ecosystem perspective. We can do it. We can map this out and solve this riddle. It doesn't have to be a guessing game. So, that's the fact is that NESP has funded an awesome amount of science. The data's available. We just got to create the roadmap. And I think we can do it, unlike any other nation. I'll just say that if you're going to achieve a living in harmony with nature by 2050, this is another way of looking at it. Yes, you can get 30 by 2030 and get it in the right place, but what you do in the other 70% is clearly critical, okay? And there's going to be a massive rush for energy, resources, infrastructure, raw materials. So again, even if you get your 30 by 2030 right, you've got to get your other 70% right as well, at least ensure that you don't completely bugger up the place at the same time. So it's, you've got to actually have both sides of the coin operating for species and ecosystems. The only other thing I'd say before handing over to Emily is that I think another conversation we've got to have in the next couple of days, and also just over the next few years, is this concept of other effective conservation measures. While protected areas are really very important, they always will be, this concept of other effective conservation measures when you come to 30 by 2030 is going to be incredibly important from an Australian perspective. And that means we've got to work out what counts and why it should count. Getting that right and understanding what counts as an ACUICN is more important than the target itself, I'd say, from a biodiversity point of view. And right now, I think we're still working through it. I think people like Mark Hawkins is, here, but we've got to get this right. This is the kind of thing that if we don't get right, we could be back 20 years in the past if we don't get it right. But if we get it right, it's a massive chance to get things moving positively in the future. So thanks very much for your time. I'll hand over